Alexandra Botez defeated Magnus Carlsen, achieving chess immortality in the year 2023 during a private streaming match with the GOAT of chess himself, Magnus Carlsen. But how did Alexandra pull it off? Let's find out. In the game, she opens 1 c4, and Magnus Carlsen replies knight f6, then knight c3 and c5 on the board, the symmetrical English. Of course, Black's idea with the move c5 is to stop an early d4 advance from White. Now White g3, intending bishop g2 next, putting the bishop on the long diagonal, and Black follows up the same. Knight c6, then g6, intending bishop g7 himself, same idea, bishop on the long diagonal. Now from here, Alexandra Botez goes for a very popular idea in the English opening, that's with d3 at e4, gaining more space in the center. So d3 and e4 on the board. How is Magnus going to respond? Well, he stays cool, calm, and collected, castling, then going d6, and finally the move rook to b8, preparing that b5 idea, expanding on the queen side. Now from here, Alexandra Botez has a choice. Her main ideas were going to be a4, trying to clamp down on the b5 break from Black, or going rook b1 and a3 herself, setting up b4 ideas. However, instead of that, she advances on the king side immediately with the move f4. This turns out to be a little bit premature. She wants to attack Black's king, but this is not a good time to do it. Now in the game, Magnus plays the excellent move knight to e8, simply getting the knight out of the way of future attacks with e5, and beyond that, the knight is heading to the wonderful c7 square, and from there it's going to be supporting b5 breaks, and the knight even has access to the e6 square and then the d4 square. And not to mention the bishop on g7 finally being opened up. So very good multi-purpose move from Magnus Carlsen. Now Alexandra Botez goes bishop d2, decent idea, but not really that great. Instead, f5 was probably the move. And now Magnus, knight to c7, good moves, continuing that plan, supporting the b5 square and setting up knight e6 to d4 ideas. Now here, Alexandra Botez finally figures out what's going on. She advances on the queen side with the move a4, cutting down on b5 ideas from Black, but Black simply responds a6, setting up b5 all the same. Now here, Alexandra, queen c2, trying to do something with the queen, but this does nothing to stop the b5 advance from Black. And here, Magnus simply strikes on the queen side with that planned move b5. Now from here, there is a tremendous amount of tension on the queen side. Of course, the a pawns and Black's b pawn all being attacked, and for that reason, there are a bunch of exchanges that happen right now. Alexandra Botez takes with the a pawn, Magnus takes back. Then from there, the knights come flying off the board. Knight takes b5, knight takes b5 back. Then finally, c takes and rook takes. And in the end, Black gains the open file and a tremendous amount of pressure on that b2 pawn from White. And for that reason here, Magnus Carlsen as Black has a very large advantage on move 15. Now, of course, this was a special Blitz match. Here in this game, Magnus Carlsen only has 30 seconds total on the clock to the 5 minutes of Alexandra Botez. And for that reason, despite being behind, Alexandra Botez still has winning chances here. Now, in the game, she goes bishop c3, trying to cut off Black's bishop on g7 and defending the pawn on the b2 square. It's a very good move and kind of the idea of bishop d2, a move earlier. Now, Black queen b6, increasing the pressure on that b2 pawn, but also setting up these discovered attacks on the king on the h1 square. So here, Alexandra really needs to find a way to safeguard that king, and if she doesn't, she better have a good reason. Well, in the game, she goes rook f to b1, simply further supported that pawn on the b2 square. However, this move is very sketchy, but here Magnus Carlsen has the ability to go c4, expanding on the queen side right away with that discovered attack we just talked about. And the idea is that the king moves, say, to h1, then you jump in knight to b4, hitting the queen with the knight, and the tactics are a little complicated, but Magnus Carlsen would come out on top as Black here. Instead, he simply goes bishop g4, increasing the pressure on that knight on the e2 square. So not a bad move at all. Here, Alexandra Botez knocks off that bishop on the g7 square once and for all. Bishop takes g7 on the board, and of course, king takes back. And here, Alexandra Botez, she moves the king over to the h1 square. It looks very logical, king h1 on the board. Of course, the idea is to get out of the discovered attack of the queen. However, here, knight to c3 was necessary, trying to knock off that rook from the very good b5 square. And now here, because Alexandra Botez missed that knight c3 idea on the prior move, here Magnus punishes her. He goes bishop takes e2, and then after queen takes the move knight to d4, jumping in with the knight and hitting the queen. So far, Magnus Carlsen as Black really picking on Alexandra Botez in this game. Now White, queen d2, getting out of the attack of the knight, but here Magnus, rook b8, just further increasing the pressure on the b2 square with the queen, the rook, and the rook here. Now, Alexandra, as she sees this, rook a2 on the board, just defending, but Magnus jumps in with the other rook, rook to b3. And from here, that rook increases the pressure on the d3 square. We can see queen b5 IDs, but potentially coming next. Then both the queen and the rook are ganging up on this weak pawn. Now here, Alexandra Botez plays a very good move, both objectively and from a practical standpoint. That is the idea, e5, trying to get counterplay. She's playing against that pawn on d6, and she's also activating the bishop on this long diagonal here, controlling the a8 square. So excellent move from Alexandra. Now Magnus ignores the threat. He simply goes queen to b4, offering the trade of queens. His idea is he's in time trouble right now, and he needs to simplify the position a little bit to make it a little bit easier in this kind of position. And here Alexandra, she does not go for the queen trade. That was the best idea. And instead, queen e3, the queen staying on the board for now. But here, Magnus Carlsen jumps back with the knight to the f5 square, simply hitting the queen on e3, and the queen, once again, simply has to go somewhere. Where's it going to go? Well, in the game, queen e2 was played, but then Magnus, queen to d4, further increasing the pressure on that poor d3 pawn. That pawn is not alone for this world. Well, here, Alexandra Botez, once again, is showing she's not such a bad player after all. She goes e6. This looks a little bit weird, but she's trying to counterplay on this e-file. Black takes back, the queen jumps in to the e6 square, and from there, that pawn on the e7 square would be vulnerable to the queen. So Alexandra, very good move, trying to get some counterplay here. But Magnus, of course, he's not amused. Queen takes d3 is the move, offering that queen trade. And here, Alexandra finally allows it. She gives in, plays the move rook to e1, defending the queen on the e2 square. And from there, Magnus simply captures on e2, and Alexandra captures back. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he's already up one pawn, and he's about to win the second one, and he secures it with the move knight to d4. Of course, f takes e6 right away would be bad, because rook takes e6 wins back the pawn. However, when you go knight to d4 first, with the fork on the rook and the pawn, it ensures you win the clean pawn, and Alexandra Botez has no chance of winning it back in this game. Now here, Alexandra, rook d2, getting the rook out of the attack, and Magnus simply wins back that pawn on the e6 square. F takes e6, and here black is definitively up 2 pawns in this game. And although Alexandra Botez is technically down material, Magnus, of course, started this game with just 30 seconds on the clock. He's already in a little bit of time pressure. Now here, Alexandra, rook to a7, trying to create some threats of her own, trying to put Magnus even more time pressure. Magnus responds, king to f6. But Alexandra looking kind of sharp so far in this game. Now rook to a2, simply retreating the rook back to the second rick. And here Magnus needs to find a way to increase the pressure. He doesn't find it yet. He first goes rook to e3, then shuffles back to the b3 square. Not a great sequence. Here Alexandra king f2, and she gets the move king to g1 to f2 in for free. So Alexandra making a little comeback. But Magnus here finds his stride. h5. His idea, of course, is to launch through with the pawn to the h4 square, trying to create more weaknesses in the white position. So, for example, if he got h4 and then h takes g3 on the board, followed by h takes g3 back, then this pawn on the g3 square would be less defended. Black could go knight to f5, targeting that pawn with both the knight and the rook, and that pawn may fall after all. So excellent little micro plan from Magnus. Now here, Alexandra Botez, bishop e4, trying to put some pressure perhaps on the g6 square. But Magnus immediately smacks her back, d5 on the board, smacking that bishop back to the g2 square. And then he continues his plan, h4. Man, Magnus being a big bully in this game. All right, bishop h3 from Alexandra, trying to stay active. But Magnus takes on h3 or g3, and then knight to f5 with that double attack on that pawn on the g3 square. Now, of course, here, bishop takes f5 is possible from white. Black would probably recapture with the g-pawn, and that does keep that pawn on the g3 square alive for now. However, that idea has the drawback of opening up the g-file for Black's rook, and then rook to g8 ideas followed by perhaps rook g3 would be very dangerous. So with that in mind, Alexandra Botez does not take the knight on f5, and instead she plays a little waiting move, rook to e2. Now from here, Magnus, knight d4, jumping in with the knight, trying to pressure the rook on the e2 square. The rook goes to d2, and here Magnus further increases the pressure with the move rook to h8, activating the rook on the other open h-file. Of course, that pawn on b3 is not going to fall for a while. So with that in mind, Magnus Carlsen tried to create some additional weaknesses in the white camp. Now here, Alexandra Botez is no dummy. She spots the threat. Simply rook takes h3. She moves her king over to the g2 square, defending the bishop on h3. So far, so good. But now Magnus opening up more lines of attack with the move g5. His goal is simply wants to open up the f-file and the g-file, making it easier for him to attack Alexandra Botez. Now white rook to f2, trying to defend. Magnus jumps in with the g-pawn, g4, putting pressure on that bishop on the h4 square. And here this may look like a temporary pawn sacrifice. White can simply win the pawn on g4. That is what Alexandra does. She has no choice with the bishop. Bishop takes g4 on the board, but here Magnus rook to g8, and the obvious threat is, of course, the rook is attacking the bishop on the g4 square. However, beyond that, as soon as the bishop moves anywhere, there is going to be a threat with the rook on that pawn on g3, so the double attack here. Now, bishop f3, trying to keep the bishop alive. But as usual, Magnus has his ideas. Here, instead of the obvious move, knight takes f3, then white could respond, rook takes f3, and it looks like there white is defending. So instead, here Magnus, knight to f5 is the move with the attack on the g3 pawn with the knight and the rook. Now, g4 from Alexandra Botez, again trying to defend, but here the knight has access to the e3 square and it jumps right in, knight to e3 check. And now, of course, the problem is the double attack on that g4 pawn with the knight and the rook on the g8 square. So king g3, the king moves forward trying to defend, but obviously, due to some tactics, this does not defend the pawn on the g4 square. Here, black simply takes, obviously, king takes g4, not a legal move, but also bishop takes g4, not legal because of the pin by the rook on the b3 square. Now white plays a waiting move, rook to e2, but it turns out this is a very big mistake. Instead, the key move for white was rook to a3, trying to get rid of the threats by the rook on the b3 square. Instead, rook to e2 on the board. And here, Magnus immediately punishes this mistake by white with a series of very precise moves. First of all, knight to e5, and of course, here that knight on the e5 square cannot be taken because of the discovered check by the rook on g8 on the king, and beyond that, black has that double attack on the bishop on the f3 square with the rook and the knight. So very beautiful idea by Magnus. Now the king retreats, but then rook takes f3, wins the bishop on the spot. Now Magnus is just up a piece plus the pawns with an attack. However, of course, Magnus is in time control here, so the game is not over yet. Now king e1, knight d3 from Magnus, the double attack on that pawn on the f4 square and the king as well. And now king d2 from Alexandra, and knight takes f4 is the move. Now Alexandra's only chance is to hang on and hope Magnus runs out of time. All right, rook e1. But now rook to g2 check, forcing the king back to the last rank. King to d1. The king is now isolated on the first rank. This is definitely not good for Alexandra. All right, let's see if she can defend. Rook to a6, then rook d2, followed by knight to d3, forking both the king and the rook. And here Magnus does not take the rook right away. Instead, rook takes b2 is the move, forcing the king to the a1 square. Of course, the c1 square being covered by the knight. Now king to a1, then knight takes e1, winning the rook. Here Magnus is up a rook, a knight, and 4 pawns. However, he's got only a couple seconds left on the clock. Here Alexandra pulls the rook back, rook to a3, then rook to a2 from Magnus. And I was watching the live stream. Here Magnus had pre-moved the move, rook takes a2, then rook takes. However, Alexandra plays a very clutch move, king to b1. And here Magnus Carlsen's pre-move did not work. His rook did not automatically take the rook, so it wasn't taken in the first place. And here, shockingly, Magnus Carlsen ran out of time, leading to a victory by Alexandra Botez. Wow, what a game. And in case you're curious, here Magnus has a mate in 2. The idea is rook takes a3, then king to c1 is forced. Literally every other square is covered by the rooks, king c1. And then obviously rook to a1 is checkmate, so Magnus had a forced mate in 2, but he lost on time. Wow, what a game. Alright, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and smash that like button and check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist. And I'll see you in the next video.